QSO Today, episode 220, Mark Rosenberg, 4X1KS. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit and a host of other kits and parts for the ham radio builder. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Uth, 4Z1UG, your host. My QSO today is with my friend Mark Rosenberg, 4X1KS, who is one of the most active amateurs in Israel and part of our English-speaking community here. Mark seems to be involved in just about every aspect of ham radio, from contesting, repairing his own rigs to home brewing. Mark shares his ham radio story in this QSO Today. 4X1KS, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Mark?
4Z1UG, this is 4X1 Kilo Sierra. How are you?
I'm great, Mark. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
That's a really good question. It's a long and convoluted story that starts probably when I was a little kid, tampering with everything that I could tamper and tinker with. I would say that I remember when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I discovered screwdrivers and small tools because my dad was very handy around the house, and I took apart my mother's AM radio, and that was my. Unfortunately, I didn't get electrocuted playing with that thing, but that was already 5 or 6 years old. Sometime later, I would say probably around age 12, I had a next-door neighbor who was into CB radio. A lot of hams, I guess, started off as CB radio when they were kids. So I convinced my parents to buy me a CB radio, and he later became a ham. And I distinctly remember being about 12 or 13. And he said, "Come over, I want to show you something." And sure enough, he had a Yaesu. I think it was an FT101, and I was completely overwhelmed. Unfortunately, it ended there for a long time because he picked up and he moved to Ohio. I was living in Pennsylvania, and he picked up and he moved to Ohio, and that was my chance to get involved in ham radio at an early age. You know, I just also remember that he gave me the manual. Eric, do you remember the original manual back in the 60s and 70s, the novice manual that the ARRL put out? So I actually had a copy when I was 12, and I remember looking through it and reading it, and I thought, whoa, this is really overwhelming. It ended up going on the bookshelf and then disappearing because he left, and that was my ladder to moving from CB and climbing into getting an actual license disappeared for a long time.
And how long was that, and what happened in between?
I was always tinkering. I mean, that's a lot of hams. You know hams, I know hams. Most of them tinker mechanically, electronically, tinker with electricity. It's in the blood, and that never stopped. I was always building or doing something with tools. But I would say many years later, I moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and that was after I graduated college. I was working on my master's at the time, and I was living in Tennessee, and somebody came to visit from Israel, and he had with him a Sony shortwave radio. And I asked him, well, what are you doing with that? And he said, well, every night I listen to the Israel Broadcasting Authority has English news, and I listen to it. If conditions are good, I can hear it on my little shortwave radio. I said, wow, that sounds really interesting. So I had to do it. So I bought the same model that he had from a place called Lentini. I don't know if you remember them.
No.
Lentini Communications, I believe, was in somewhere in the northeast of the country, like in Rhode Island or Boston or something like that. Anyway, I bought the Sony radio. I still have it. It's in very, very good condition. And with that came a magazine of shortwave listening. So I spent a month or two listening, and then an interesting thing happened. I was perusing this magazine, and there was a very, very tiny little ad, about 1 inch by 1 inch, in the back of this magazine. And it was an ad from the ARRL or somebody else saying, "Shortwave listener, get your ham radio license." And that's really how it started.
In those intervening years, and you say you ended up in Memphis, Tennessee, working on a master's degree, what was your education in?
Well, I went to school in New York at a place called Yeshiva University, and I had a degree in business. And then when I went down to Memphis, I continued my education in business. I have an MBA in finance, but I was always leaning towards the technical side. It's interesting because in high school, every single guy that was a part of my crew or my friends, they all became either engineers or physics guys. And for some reason, I bucked the trend and I went into finance. But the need for technology was always there.
So you got your first amateur radio license where? In Memphis?
Yes, I took it. I took it in Memphis. I was very focused. I was around 1990. So it took me from age 12 or 13 when I had my first exposure to an actual ham radio operator. It took another 18 years before I actually got my license. I guess I was around 30 in 1990 or so, and I took the exams real quick. And then, back then there was a code test, so I was determined to get an extra class. So I worked real hard. I passed my 20 words per minute code test, and it was wonderful. It was just really terrific. Put up a tower, put a beam up on the tower, and met a bunch of really terrific hams in Memphis, and the rest is history.
Did you become part of an amateur radio club in Memphis?
Absolutely. The Memphis Amateur Radio Club, very nice bunch of people. And really, it also led to a business opportunity because I started hanging out with the people down it's not in existence anymore, but there was Memphis Amateur Electronics. And Memphis Amateur Electronics was a ham radio dealer in Memphis. They were very big in used gear and repairs, and there were four guys that owned the business together. And I don't think it was about the money for them. I think it was about the camaraderie and being a good vendor to the ham community in Memphis and around the country. And through them, I met many, many really terrific hams in Memphis, Tennessee.
What was your first rig?
My first rig is actually sitting right next to me at this moment. It's a Kenwood TH28A. That's a handheld 2-meter rig. So I bought this little handy talkie as soon as I passed my technician. I bought this from Memphis Amateur, and it still works. It's a good little radio.
But you were determined to get your code speed up to 20 and proceed all the way to the extra class. So how did you do that with this rig, or did you go on to get a low band rig right away?
Oh yeah, as soon as I passed the technician, I was already studying and preparing for the next volunteer examiner opportunity. And they did the exams at the club meetings, which were about once a month. So it was on a monthly basis I was going back to take exams. So right away I bought a Kenwood TS850, which I wish I had kept it. I didn't keep it. I wish it was still here because I think it's a very, very good rig. And I think there's a lot of them still out there. So as soon as I had that, a G5 RV went up into the trees behind my house. And I started out like a lot of hams with my general, probably working at about 7 or 8 or 9 words per minute. Even though I passed the general was 13, of course, but it was hard to work at 13 then. And so I was doing 7, 8, or 9 words per minute, and it builds from there.
I hear a lot of people on the air when they're first getting started that they're using the 100 watts in a wire, and the G5 RV seems to be very popular because it's a multi-band antenna. How did that whole combination work for you, and did that bring amateur radio success?
Definitely. Being in Memphis was an ideal location. I had access to the West Coast, to the East Coast. A lot of times if propagation wasn't exactly the way you wanted it, if you were in New Jersey or Maryland or a place like that, so California was just not going to happen. And being in Memphis, so there were a lot of opportunities to worked all states. I think I did worked all states very quickly, and it was a goal. Everything that back then It was the goal was to work all states or counties, whatever it was, and get the certificate. So I worked very diligently on that.
Now, in those days, obviously, you had to get to the 20 words a minute in order to get the extra class license, and it sounds to me like you were on a pretty fast track. Even with a general license, did you avoid operating the voice modes while you were obtaining the extra class license?
No, I'd say I was very much fairly, I divided my time between sideband and CW probably pretty evenly. I still do, although mostly now it's mostly CW, but I do like to get on and talk sideband. I think that back then it was what were your options? Your options were CW, sideband, FM with the handy talkie through the local repeater, and it wasn't until a little later that Packet came along, and I bought a Cantronics TNC.
KPC3 or something like that.
It was a Cam Plus, and I think I still have them. Don't even have the equipment to run them anymore, and they've become kind of obsolete. But it wasn't until a little later. So we hams were really limited to sideband, AM, and CW. I didn't have what I needed to do RIDI, and so it was fairly limited. But for me, it was about making as many QSOs. It was a real joy to come home from work and to get on the radio, and if the bands were open, and start making contacts all over the world.
Did you become a contester as a way to make contacts?
I cannot remember contesting too much. Certainly not the big contests. CW, forget it. I wasn't fast enough until a little later. But as far as sideband, I probably worked a few contests. I was a little overwhelmed as a new ham when it came to contests. It was pretty intimidating because real contesters out there, their skills are pretty impressive, if you know what I mean.
Now, as an older ham, my guess is you were probably married at this point. Did you have to kind of negotiate with the XYL over the acquisition of equipment and time in order to be able to hone up on your skills?
That's pretty funny. As I remember, we built an addition onto the house, and I specifically made a room for ham radio, and that's when I put up the tower, and I had the beam up there, and wires, and then satellite. I got into satellite. We can talk about that. But I remember my wife was pretty amenable to the whole thing. I don't remember being chased out of the shack to do this or do that. She was a pretty good sport about that.
Because she knew that you weren't hanging out in front of the Gibson guitar factory.
That's for sure. No, you know what? Work was over at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Then came home, have dinner, and then get on the radio and hope for good propagation. And it was a very nice ham lifestyle.
Now, you say you got into satellite at that time. What kind of satellite rig did you put together, and what did you operate, and what did you think of it?
So the satellite, I've got to give a little bit of a backstory to really understand how I got into satellite, because it led to a lot of very interesting things. Okay, so I had mentioned that I was friends with the people at Memphis Amateur Electronics. I don't know if you ever dealt with them. Did you ever have any contact with Memphis Amateur?
No, I never did.
Okay, so they are no longer in business, but they were in business for a long time, and they had a little building in Memphis, and people would hang out there. Really terrific guys. The company that I was working for sold out, and I had an opportunity to either stay on with the company or to go on my own. And I made the decision. Okay, I'm gonna get out of at the time I was in the mortgage business. I'm going to get out of the mortgage business, and I'm going to go do something in computers. So I went down to Memphis Amateur, and I talked to my good friend Marcio Robilio, KU40, and I asked them if they were interested in leasing out part of their building. And it turns out that they were amenable to that. So I ended up opening a business inside of Memphis Amateur Electronics. Now, for a ham radio operator, that's like going to the candy store every day, and that's what it was. And so I ended up getting some good equipment, and I ran my business out of their location. It was absolutely a marriage made in heaven. Well, there was a very, very nice and experienced ham who had a lot of experience in satellites and microwaves and things like that. Now, his name was Robert Barbie Jr., his call W4AMI. At that time, he was already retired. His call sign is now been picked up by a club somewhere else, but he was the Elmer's Elmer, and he became my satellite Elmer. And he himself had a great, great story. But what a wonderful person. And he was a lifelong tinkerer, and he taught me something very, very important. And I think a lot of hams can relate to this. You got to have a hobby. And he was already retired. His hearing wasn't as good as it was when he was younger. He was mostly deaf, but he could communicate, and he could hear Morse code. And he taught me something important. You've got to have a hobby. And I see a lot of people that get older, they don't have a hobby. But I don't know any ham radio operators that are not going to have something to do when they're retired and getting on in years. There's always something to do for a ham radio operator. So he was the guy that led me into satellites.
What did Barbie teach you about satellites, and do you still apply some of that today?
Well, he taught me everything about how to operate satellites. He was one of the pioneers back when Oscar 7 or 8 were just launched, and he was one of the old-timers, and he was really he was well-known. And as a matter of fact, after I got involved with AMSAT, I actually worked out a deal with AMSAT, and we created the W4AMI Outstanding Operator Achievement Award, which I became the manager of, and that was specifically designed for hams that made 1,000 contacts or more. That award is still in existence today, and the AMSAT people are still giving that award to anyone who works 1,000 or more, with a special award for 5,000. As far as I know, it's still running, and there are probably at this point maybe well over a couple of 100 hams that have received that award. They understood that Bob Barbie was a satellite pioneer back in the old days, and they graciously, at AMSAT, they were willing to inaugurate this award, and they made me manager of the award, and it was a wonderful experience. And all of that knowledge about satellites, antennas, and how to point your antenna, and the software, and most of that I got from Bob Barbie. And he was a really spectacular guy. He he at a very, very young age, he was when he came back from World War II, he was immediately snagged by his commanding officer and put in charge of a very large building project. He was an electrical engineer, and he later became chairman of a big electrical contracting engineering company that built some pretty spectacular projects in the United States and some around the world. And he retired, and he had this wonderful, wonderful hobby called ham radio. And I can't say enough about him.
Now, when I think of Oscar 7 or I think of those old satellites, I think about having a set-top base station rig, a big antenna array with UHF and VHF antennas on it, that were steerable in order to track the satellite. And I think we were kind of like new in computers, or relatively new in computers then. What kind of setup did Barbie have you set up there in Memphis? Okay, so I naturally I did my due diligence, and I bought a Kenwood TS790, which is sitting right here in the shack with me today. It's still quite functional. And I bought a Yaesu 5400 rotator elevator. And so that was designed to take care of azimuth and elevation for my satellite antennas. And the software was Nova for Windows, which was available through AMSAT. And with that software, you could download the Keplerian elements, which are the data, the 7 elements that are required in order to track a celestial body. And you could download that information, put it into your software, and it would tell you where to point your antenna. Now, what people that are doing satellite today, if they're new, if they weren't around with Oscar 10 and Oscar 13 and Oscar 40, what they don't realize is that the orbits of some of these what were called phase 3D satellites were very large elliptical orbits, which meant that when the satellite was very far away from the Earth, you could have a window
that would last for quite a long time and cover half of the planet. And so it was possible to work tremendous amounts of DX through the satellite. But you needed to have proper equipment. Nowadays, with the low Earth orbit satellites, so you just need a handheld antenna and a handy-talkie, and you can work an FM satellite very relatively easily. But back then, you needed preamplifiers and you needed some power, and it was much more involved to work some of the big satellites then.
Now, are any of those satellites still existing, and can a ham with the same kind of rig operate those satellites today?
Unfortunately, they're gone. They burned up. Oscar 10, because it had an orbit that was not what it was supposed to be. Oscar 10 is still out there floating, as far as I know, and occasionally I haven't checked it in a while, but occasionally it's possible to actually hear something from Oscar 10. Oscar 13 and Phase 3D, Oscar 40, AO 40, those things have already re-entered and burned up. But they were wonderful because you could talk to a guy in Europe or in Hawaii, assuming that the satellite was way out there, and you could talk for a long time. And a lot of people it was a different kind of QSO. It wasn't the rapid kind of frantic, hurry up and get it done because the satellite pass is going to be over in 12 minutes.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. October is here and contest season is beginning with QSO parties, school club roundup, sweepstakes in November, and the CQ Worldwide contest also at the end of the month and in November. Now is the time to get the ICOM transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative transceivers that fit your ham radio budget. See how you can make the most out of contest season with one of these transceivers. The IC7851 has the competitive edge that you've been looking for and the endorsement by Dr. Ulrich Rohde, N1UL, in episode 208 of the QSO Today podcast as being the best transceiver on the market today. Raise the bar and hear what others cannot hear with this flagship HF 50 MHz transceiver. This is due to ICOM engineers focusing on a new local oscillator design that drastically reduces phase noise. This noise reduction and purity of the LO result in an RMDR of 110 dB, allowing you to hear the extremely weak signals, making the IC7851 the perfect rig for making contacts at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. In addition, this fine rig has a spectrum scope, dual receivers, and a digital voice recorder. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham radio operator wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM 7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. This rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with compact design which will far exceed your expectations. It includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD memory card slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com. And when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. Are there any Phase 3D satellites on the planner at AMSAT, or is that kind of a phase of life that is we're now past life?
The Phase 3D, the elliptical orbits are done. I don't think there's plans to launch any more satellites like that, at least in the short term. The plan now is that they're going to launch a geostationary satellite, which will sit over the equator. Exactly where that will be, I don't know. I don't know if Israel's going to be in the footprint of that satellite, but that's the plan. And I don't know if I'm for that or against that. In a lot of ways, I'm kind of against it because I think it turns satellite communications almost into like a cell phone.
Or repeater.
Yeah, into a repeater in space
Right.
that's
Repeater in space.
geostationary. And I find that to be a little bit that kind of rubs me the wrong way. I like the idea of tracking the satellite. I bought a dish antenna, what people used to call a barbecue grill, because it's actually like a barbecue grill, only it's concave, and that was for 2.4 gigahertz. And you had to point your satellite and you had to point your antennas, and it was a real challenge, and it wasn't always an automatic. It wasn't like an automatic QSO. And putting a satellite geostationary is like an automatic QSO. So I'm not so much in favor of that.
So you're operating satellites in Memphis, Tennessee. You've gotten to your extra class license also in Memphis. How did you find your way here to Israel, where you live now in Hashmonaim, not far from the airport?
So that was about in 1994. Like I said, the company I was working for got bought out. I immediately I made the decision to go into the computer business, which turned out to be pretty enjoyable. I moved into the building with Memphis Amateur, picked up a lot of nice equipment like the Collins gear that I have here, and an old Ten-Tech radio and some other things. And 3 years into running that business, I had always wanted to move to Israel. And 3 years into that business, I found a buyer. So I sold that.
You sold the business?
Yeah, I sold the business to one of my customers, actually. And then we packed up and we moved a little interim stop in Baltimore. And then a few months later, we moved to Israel. And we lived in Jerusalem. I had a wonderful ham radio set up in Jerusalem. I was probably the premier station in Jerusalem. There's no question. I was on top of a mountain, on top of a hill, and my antenna was 110 feet in the air. So it was what we call it primo.
Now, I somehow remember, seeing that antenna before actually knowing you. But now, if you drive around Jerusalem, you won't see. I don't think you'll see any antennas. There might be one ham in the middle of Jerusalem that has an antenna not far from where you used to live. So how was that? How was that working in Jerusalem in those days?
Well, interestingly, the guy 2 buildings away from my building was a KLM Yagi on top of the building, and that guy I never met him, but there was a guy who was from South America, and his father lived in South America, and he lived on my street, and his antenna preceded mine. By the time I had moved in, he had already moved somewhere else, and I think he might have gone back to South America. I don't know his story, but I put my antenna up, put a little. I think I put up probably 2 sections of Roan 25 on top of the building, and put up my antenna, put up a wire for 80 and for 40, and satellite antennas on top of a post, and a mast that was drilled into the building. I think that's probably all that I had up there, maybe a vertical. But I had a ham shack in my we were on the top floor. I had a ham shack there, and it was a prime location because I was in Jerusalem. I was very high up, and conditions were quite good. And around 1998, 2000, things were quite good.
We call Jerusalem the Holy Basin. I actually I was standing with another ham on the Mount of Olives not long ago, and I realized from there it looks like the old city is actually in a bowl, but the city of Jerusalem is actually much larger than the old city, and it has ridges that run through it in kind of like a star. So you were actually on one of those ridges, and those ridges are actually quite high, almost 3,000 feet above sea level. So were you able to get a very interesting DX look from Jerusalem to the rest of the world?
Oh, yeah. Oh, it was wonderful. Conditions were nice. Propagation was very good.
You were located on one of the ridges in Jerusalem. Near San Simon?
Yeah, I was in San Simon, which is a neighborhood in southern Jerusalem, very high up. I'd say we were probably 750 meters up, something like that. And I'm going to actually, while we speak, I'm looking back on my log. I really I'm going to give a little plug for somebody if that's okay.
Sure.
I use a log called AC Log. I've been using that for 20 years, and it's a wonderful piece of software. I love it. And the guy that runs it is is very responsive and very helpful. So I'm looking back on my log, and I see back in 2000, I distinctly remember being able to get on 15 meters and 20 meters and talk to the United States like it was a phone call. It was really terrific, just wonderful conditions.
And this was with a tri-band beam?
It has a 4-element tri-band or Cushcraft A4S, which I still have. It's sitting up on my current location here in Hashonaim. And it works very well. I had to, everybody has to do work on their antennas over a 20-year period. You're going to have to do a little work on it. So I did have to take apart the traps, but it's a very, very good antenna and still working.
Oh, that's very cool. Okay, and you say at the time you also moved the Yaesu 5400 rotator and elevator and the satellite antennas there as well? Oh,
yeah. Yeah, there's no way I was going to, I think that Bob Barbie would say, what, you're going to move and you're not going to have a satellite antenna? Come on. So of course, that was one of the first things I did was drill a pipe into the side of the building at the top of the building and mount the 5400. And the 5400 had a fiberglass boom, and on that boom was a helical antenna for 432 and a cross Yagi for 2 meters, and also the barbecue grill, which was for 2.4 gigahertz. So everything fit on that mast, and the 5400 would spin it around and elevate it to whatever degree I wanted.
Now, do you have that same setup at your place now?
I have. It's similar. Because the satellites aren't the same, I don't need that kind of gain anymore. So for 2 meters, I'm just using a 3-element Yagi, and for 70 centimeters, I'm using cross Yagi, which is probably 12 elements. And nothing on 2.4 gigahertz because there's nothing right now. There's nothing on 2.4 gigahertz as far as I know. So,
if you were going to make a recommendation to someone that wants to get into satellites now, you actually could have the same rotator, although maybe that's that's a pretty heavy duty rotator, but you could have something similar, and but the antenna array itself does not have to be as long or as heavy or as large, so it could fit easily on a city lot or even on an apartment house roof.
Oh yeah. For sure, and they could even do it by hand. They could take one of these dual band Yagis on a single boom that's handheld and use it to work the FM satellites. When the FM satellites pass over, so you're going to get a good chunk of Europe. If you're in Israel, you're going to get a good chunk of Europe, in depending on the orbit, and same thing in America or wherever else you are. If you're in the United States, you're going to get a nice footprint over a good area of the United States. You'll be able to work several states. Depending on the orbit.
And what modes would you be operating now? Besides FM, it seems to me like, FM with a handheld is, I guess that's one way to do satellites. But is there a more go-in-deep, professional, quote-unquote, satellite mode now?
Probably the people who have radios like my TS 790 would, most of them work CW on satellite. The fact is that the low Earth orbit FM satellites there's a lot of them now. It's pretty amazing when I look on my software and I see how many it seems like every 2-3 months there's a couple of satellites going up. So there's a lot of small FM satellites. The problem is that the passes are short and there's a lot of activity. So it's hard to make a QSO more than just exchanging call signs and a signal report. So and a locator. So probably it's a little less crowded, I'd say. If you're working CW, it's a little less crowded. So on satellite, which I get on not nearly as much as I used to, and on HF, I spend most of my time working CW, just because it seems to have become a good fit for me at this point in my ham career.
If you're operating CW on satellites, which satellite is the CW satellite, or which satellites are the CW satellites?
Okay, so the CW satellites are the Chinese satellites. They put up these little satellites. Those are CW, and I'm looking on my list right now.
I can go and post in the show notes page a list of the satellites, or at least a link to the list of satellites and what the modes are. But I guess what I'm asking, Mark, is that it's still possible if you're an old timer with with a rig like the TS-790 to actually work satellites and not just work the FM satellites that are flying in low elliptical orbits.
Sure, absolutely. Well, they're all LEOs. None of them have the large elliptical orbits now. They're all LEO satellites. They're elliptical, but they're not. These are low Earth orbit satellites. But you have things like all the Chinese satellites and the FM satellites are satellites like Saudi Sat, which is interesting. It's SO-50. That's a Saudi Arabian launch satellite, and you have the AO-92 and AO-85. They have a funny name. I forget the name at the moment, but I think they're launching even more of them. I haven't updated my satellites on my satellite tracking program in quite a while, so I have some of the ones from last year. But there's new satellites. Seems that they're going up all the time. But I'd say most of my operating right now is HF, and I've pretty much focused on HF right now.
Are there a lot of Saudi operators? It seems to me that to hear that the Saudis have a satellite of their own, or putting satellites of their own up in the air. I never thought that there were that many Saudi ham radio operators.
I work them now and then. I have them in my log. Unfortunately, there's countries in our neighborhood that won't work Israel. It's a political thing. Unfortunately, I don't think ham radio should be political. But Saudi Arabia has not usually been a problem. I've been able to work many Saudi operators. Well,
I guess the question is did they contract with AMSAT, to build the satellites for them, or someone else? Or did they actually do that work themselves?
Yeah, I'm not sure how SO-50 was built. For sure, it was launched. It piggybacked on a European rocket. There's no way, they didn't launch it themselves. But I think that as far as the construction goes, they probably built it in one of their technical universities in Saudi Arabia with help from AMSAT and other engineers and technicians.
Now, you've become very involved in our All-Star Link group and also in DMR. Just by way of introduction, I think I had the first All-Star Link node in Israel on a VHF channel some years ago, and it kind of picked up some popularity. 4X1DA, I think, was second, and I think you were the third, but you seem to be kind of leading the charge in terms of helping people get on All-Star. Could you talk a little bit about All-Star and how that works for you in terms of projects?
Well, I think All-Star, I'm not really sure. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that I hear so many hams on DMR and on All-Star, and I think that there's an inverse relationship between HF propagation and the use of internet-based FM modes, and so for whatever reason, when I got in touch with 4X1DA, that was my introduction to All-Star. And like all newcomers, this was probably a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. Like all newcomers, I had no clue as to how it worked, and I didn't understand the technology. I didn't understand what a Raspberry Pi was. It's a little computer, and that's about the size of a deck of cards. I had no clue as to the software. So there's a learning curve there. But with the right mentoring and help, and fortunately you and 4X1DA, Rich, were extremely helpful. So it's possible to get up to speed on All-Star. Now, the way I feel about All-Star now is I think All-Star is a wonderful alternative to DMR and D-Star and the other digital modes. Although I very much like DMR and D-Star as well. But I think All-Star, because it's analog, the audio is very, very crisp. And I'm sure as a person who works with audio all the time, Eric, you're familiar with the fact that All-Star is a nice, crisp, clean analog audio.
Yeah, All-Star is hi-fi. That's why I like it. And the voices sound like the real voices. So I've been involved in All-Star, I don't know, probably 6 years now. But one of the things that you might take credit for, I think, Mark, is that you've actually been kind of great about pushing it out. So I think your daughter has an All-Star node now. I think there's a number of hams in your orbit that have come into your orbit who have All-Star, and we've got All-Star now running from one end of the country to the other, I think.
Well, I think that's not me. That's a combination of a bunch of people working together. I think that we have really built something special in that, considering the size of the ham population here, that All-Star is pretty well represented. We have All-Star nodes everywhere, and my daughter is a different ham radio star. I can talk about that in a minute, but All-Star is a wonderful way for, I think, particularly in our country, because we have a nice All-Star group that's English speaking. So it's an opportunity to build a network of English speakers. We get together now and then, and we have a net every Sunday night. And I think it really has been a wonderful unifying kind of force to bring together hams in a small country. And I'm actually surprised, because I think that, the United States is a very big country with I guess we're closing in on, in the United States, probably 800,000 or more hams in the United States. It's a big ham community. Same thing, Japan is enormous. But if you have a small country that has a couple thousand hams, or 3,000 or 4,000 hams, then All-Star is a very nice vehicle to build another kind of backbone where people can get together.
Yeah, I think in a country like Israel, it's there's a lot of hams that you really don't even know they're there, because it's kind of like parallel play. They're all doing their own thing. They may be doing contesting, they may be doing DXing, they might only do 20 or 40 meter CW. That's the only thing they do, or they do the digital modes. But at least I think you're right. I think that what All-Star has done, and I think what DMR is now doing, is that it's kind of bringing out people that, frankly, I've never seen before. I never knew about, and it's doing exactly that. It's kind of creating this cement between us, that even though we're all doing different things, we still have this in common. Maybe it's kind of like an intercom channel for talking ham radio. I seem to think it's like that. And I just got a DMR Zoom spot that I'm going to use to take to the States with me. I think by the time this podcast goes, I'll be actually in San Ramon at the Pacificon conference. So, and I'll have my hotspot there. And then I'll take that hotspot up to my father, who lives out in rural Washington. Thank God he's got an internet connection. And I'll still have my intercom to my friends in Israel and around the world. So I think, all of these technologies, as you say, kind of act, at least in a small country, as that kind of that cement that's kind of pulling us out of the woodwork and kind of turning us back into a community.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing. At the same time, it just occurred to me that there are probably two reasons why the popularity of DMR, D-Star, and All-Star is taking off, along with the other digital modes through the internet. And I think that one reason is that propagation is so poor right now. We're at the bottom of the sunspot cycle, and occasionally there's a blip and there's some good workable DX, but it's not easy. But the other reason, I think, is that unfortunately it's become harder and harder and more difficult to be a ham the way we were 25 years ago by just throwing up a tower and antenna. And so you have a lot of people who just don't have an opportunity to put up a proper beam or a quad or some kind of what I call a real antenna. And so if you want to work a little DX in quotation marks, so you're left with the digital modes through the internet.
Or 100 watts in a wire. What challenges have you had here in Israel? I mean, I speak about this every once in a while, but what challenges have you had here in Israel with putting up that tower and that tri-band beam and all the other things that you think are essential for a ham station to work DX?
Yeah, that was always it's like an underlying fear. I guess in America it's the same thing, depending on what neighborhood you're in. I did get a visit from the local council, sent out people and said, hey, what is that?
You should put a little background, and that is the entrance. Hashmonaim is a gated community for all intent purposes, and it has a main entrance, and your house is like right up on the right of the main entrance. So it's not like you could hide the
you can't
amateur
hide it,
radio activity there.
Yeah, there's no way to hide it. right from the main highway. You can see, if you're looking, you can see a tower on top of a roof with a big antenna on it. But you know what's interesting, Eric, is that the number of people who live in my neighborhood who, if I point out to them just in passing, oh, you didn't see my antenna? And
it's huge, by the way.
They'll say, it's a big antenna, and they say, yeah, I never noticed that. It's like, and I thought to myself, that's really interesting. People don't actually look up. You know, there could be the Goodyear blimp could be up there, and they wouldn't know. But I got a visit from the local council, which is called the Moatzah in Hebrew, and they said, well, what is that thing you got up there, and where's your permit? So it turns out that I very quickly got an engineering letter saying that it was engineered properly, it was safe, and I got a tremendous amount of help from a guy here who is, I'm not going to say who it is, but he's connected to the Israel Amateur Radio Club, and he put me in contact with the other people that need to be involved, which is the Environment Ministry. And I got a letter from them saying that it's not radiating any dangerous radiation coming off of on any of the frequencies that I operate. And so I sent those letters off, and that was it. So, but I think for a lot of people, it's tough to put up a what I call a real antenna, and it's a shame because I think it's ham radio is it's not just a hobby. But ham radio can become very important in terms of communications. We see right now there's the big hurricane going on down there in Florida, Hurricane Michael. And I'm sure that ham radio operators are going to be involved in some of the rescue operation, without a doubt. And so you don't want the antenna, but you certainly want a ham radio operator when things are not going well and you need communications. You're only all too happy to have a ham radio operator there to get you in touch with somebody that you need to be in touch with 100 miles away.
And now this message from QRP Labs. Well, Hans, G0UPL has done it again. QRP Labs announces a new 10-watt linear HF power amplifier kit for just $26 US. That's right, $26 United States currency. This power amplifier comfortably produces 10 watts from a 12-volt DC supply for every mode, including the high-duty cycle digital modes. This new linear amplifier provides 26 dB of gain from 2 to 30 MHz with a plus or minus 1 dB gain flatness over the entire range. This 10-watt HF linear power amplifier kit has no surface mount components to solder. There are a small number of transformers that need to be wound, and assembly requires care and patience. If you're a beginner, you can still do this kit. The push-pull driver stage uses two BS170 transistors in the amplifier found in the soft-walk transmitter design. This final uses two IRF510 transistors in push-pull configuration. Yes, this humble low-cost MOSFET is really capable of excellent performance all the way up to 10-meter band and beyond. Hans says the short lead lengths and PCB layout are extremely important to the success of this kit. This kit includes a huge heatsink to prevent overheating even during a 100% duty cycle. Hans sent me a message that he tested key down for 1 hour at 10 watts full power with no forced air cooling. He tested again for 15 minutes at 20 watts, 100% continuous duty cycle with no forced air cooling. He even tested this new power amplifier with a 20-volt DC power supply into an open load, a shorted load, and various mismatches without instability, oscillation, or failure. So if you have a QCX or any other QRP transmitter and want to boost its output power with a highly reliable linear power amplifier at an amazing price, then click on the link in this week's show notes page to tell Hans that you heard it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO. We also have a population here who's really spooked by cellular telephone towers, which is very funny because I think that like the average number of cell phones in the country is almost like 1.5 per every citizen here of 8 million people. So, everybody has a cell phone and a half. They carry it everywhere. They use it everywhere, but they don't want a cell phone tower in their neighborhood. On the one hand, and as a result of that, I think we've also been painted. Amateur radio operators have been painted kind of with the same brush that anything that looks like an antenna may be putting out harmful radiation, and that could potentially cause people harm. I don't know where these stories come from, or how they justify the physics of this, but this is, I think, our biggest challenge in Israel is the fact that we have a whole population that doesn't know anything about ham radio, and they don't even remember anymore that there were ham radio operators in the country since the very founding of the country. What do you think about that in terms of what's our future? What should we do in order to create more awareness?
Well, without a doubt, I think it's incumbent upon us. When I say us, I mean the people that are listening to your podcast and to our generation of ham radio operators. We have to do what we can to make the hobby attractive to young people. So in Hebrew, for example, the word for a ham radio operator is chovevei radio, a chovev radio. And the word chovev in Hebrew is chaviv, which means dear. So, like, it's dear to me. Chaviv is something is dear to you. So for those of us who feel like ham radio is something that is dear to us, like I do, because I think it's a great hobby. And I've had a million hobbies. I have a skipper's license for offshore sailing, and I do road cycling and on a bike, and I do all these different hobbies. But I have to say, what's the hobby that is in the center of everything? And it has to be ham radio, because ham radio is an incredible hobby. You can do. There's so many facets and there's so many things you can do. What avenue do you want to go on today? Well, I have ham radio. I can go any direction I want to go in, and it's a wonderful thing. And so I think it's our generation is responsible for this reason. I actually, back in Memphis, when my daughter was 8 years old, she passed 2 exams as an 8-year-old, and she was one of the youngest little hams in America. She still has her American call sign, which is KF4OHL. I used to call her OHL as one happy lady, and so she had that from age 8. And then last year, with a little help from some friends, she's now married with children, and she upgraded to general class, and so now she has her she had an Israeli call already, but now she's 4X5 Yankee Lima, and so I'm very happy that my daughter is at least licensed, although she's very busy at work. She doesn't have time to talk on the air all the time, but I think it's our job. We're responsible. We can't pass the buck to anybody to somehow make ham radio grow or make it more appealing to a younger generation. I think it's incumbent upon us to get that done. For the same reason, I'm now working with my granddaughter who's 10 to hopefully have a third generation ham in the family. I think that it used to be that if you were a ham radio operator in the old days, there was a really good chance that at least one of your kids was going to be a ham radio operator. And I think it really is our job to make that happen.
Can you think of any projects? It occurs to me that perhaps the DMR hotspots, the stuff with the Raspberry Pis, that kind of stuff, seems to have maybe that kind of appeal to the younger people. What do you think about that? Can you think of any projects that if you were going to do a ham radio project, maybe in a maker space or something like that, what would you do to attract a younger generation?
That's an interesting question. I can't really. I've been here for 20 years, so every time I go back to the States, which is fairly infrequently, it seems culturally quite a bit different than it was when I left the United States back in the late 90s. So I can't really speak for the youth in America. The youth in Israel are a little different because their structure is different. At 18 years old, they know they're going in the Army for 3 years, and when they come out from the Army, they're going to go to university. They're not going to get their degree till they're 25. But I think there's also a lot of the high tech notion here in Israel is pretty strong. High tech and startups, and there's a lot of technology here, and so I think that there's a kind of a propensity among Israeli youth to embrace technology. So I think that in terms of projects, I think the idea of Raspberry Pis and Arduinos, which is another kind of small computer, and integrating those things into ham radio, that could have some appeal. And I think it does have some appeal because we know even from our own ranks that we have a few young people that are working on the marriage between Raspberry Pis and ham radio technology, like All Star. And I'm not sure how that plays in America because I don't know if young people in America and other countries around the world have quite the same kind of focus on technology. Somehow in Israel, anyway, it seems like technology is king. If you're working in high tech or if you're an engineer, it seems like there's a lot of inertia to push kids into technology. So it might be a little bit easier here.
One of my earlier guests in an earlier podcast was Ulrich Rohde, Dr. Ulrich Rohde, N1UL. And he said that the amateur license gives you the spectrum to play and experiment in. And so, maybe for Israeli youngsters, and maybe this is true in America too, and that is that we have this amazing spectrum from essentially AC to blue light and all of the stuff in between, microwave channels, UHF, VHF, HF, all these channels. But we have all this spectrum, and the integration of this radio spectrum with these projects. Maybe it's with drones, or maybe it's with robotics. We have a number of large robotic events here in Israel every year that are part of the maker environment, I guess. And those devices could be controlled over amateur radio for perhaps greater range or lack of interference, things like that. So maybe the opportunities for attracting kids is the use of amateur radio spectrum in these kinds of projects. Now, it's different than making contacts and working DX, but it's a way to at least pull them in.
It's interesting because back in probably the mid 90s, I remember taking my daughter when she was just licensed at 8 years old, and we went on the road. And we worked the Rover UHF contest, and we ended up winning the Delta Division, which was a big deal. I still have the certificate somewhere, and around the shack there's a certificate for that. But I did that with my daughter, and I did that for a reason, because I built a couple of laser transceivers. Now, we were using visible red as a means of communications, and they're fairly simple to build. And I built a couple of laser transceivers, and we used that to be able to add one more frequency from the spectrum in order to get some more points. And I think that the issue that we're talking about here maybe is that as a ham radio operator, we're very open to I want to try that. I think that I want to try that, or I want to build that, or I want to see that work. That's like a very normal notion for a ham radio operator, because you see a new technology, so I got to try that, and so I think that for that reason, I always have some kind of project that I have in the shack that I'm working on, whether it's I'm building a tube radio and I've got another radio going, and there's always some project there, because the ham radio operator always wants to try that. So I think, okay, so we have to tap into the new generation and see what it is, what button it is you need to push in order to ignite that kind of desire to, I want to try that. I want to integrate this with that. So but once the ball is rolling, once somebody gets their license and they get a little bit motivated, it's like opening up a whole new world to somebody of all the possible things they could achieve.
Yeah, I agree 100%. What project on your bench has ignited the most? Because you're a big builder. What have you built that had the most ignition?
That's an interesting question. Something, I've got these Collins radios here. Now, this wasn't a build project.
Well, what are the Collins radios?
So I have a Collins KWM2 and I have a KWM2A, and I got very, very, very lucky, and I ended up with what's called a Collins 399C-1, which is an extremely rare external VFO. I'm very happy to have that little gem. But anyway, my one of my Collins was drifting all over the place, and I got help from a couple of hams, one in Germany and one in the United States, and took apart the PTO. There's a picture of it on my QRZ page. It is a nerve-wracking and stress-filled endeavor to take the PTO out of your Collins radio and rebuild it, pull out all the old capacitors and change the Zener diode and resolder in all the new ones. It is extremely stressful.
Let's back up here. Okay. It's extremely stressful. First of all, what is a PTO?
Okay, the PTO is how you tune the Collins. It's basically it's like a magnet on a shaft, and
it's on the tuning knob.
Yeah, it's behind the tuning knob.
I see.
Well, but the tuning knob, the mechanism on the Collins is there's gears in there, and you're not directly tuned.
It's like a watch inside.
I'm telling you, it's amazing. It's really amazing what they did.
Now is the stress coming from the fact that it's a 60, 70-year-old Collins radio?
You know what? Take all of your deepest, darkest fears, and that's basically what it is. You take apart that radio. There's a possibility that you are going to disable that thing for life unless you find somebody who's willing to help you to fix it and knows how to fix it if you screw up. And that's harder and harder to do nowadays because there aren't too many people that work on them. But I found a couple of guys, one in Germany and one in America, and I had some conversations with them, and they were very helpful. And there's some articles out there on rebuilding your PTO on a Collins radio. If you have a Collins radio, you might know what I'm talking about. Anyway, so you take it apart and you hope for the best that you're going to get it right. And so fortunately, when I was done, I did get it right, and it's very stable now. But that was probably the most rewarding. But I think probably the reason why it's the most rewarding is because it was the most dangerous because I could have destroyed the radio. Interestingly enough, that radio, I then did the what's called a stabilization mod. It's a mod to keep the Collins on frequency. And for whatever reason, that mod did not work. And when I turned on the radio, I got some smoke out of the cabinet. And so you can imagine what it feels like to turn on your Collins radio and see smoke.
Well, I can't imagine. It's the stuff of nightmares.
That's right. It is it's a really big. There aren't words to describe that. Especially this is after I finished the PTO. I'm like, okay, the radio's good, and then I went ahead and attempted this mod. For whatever reason, I did it wrong, and I found out what I did wrong. But fortunately, I was able to replace the resistor that cooked inside, and I forget exactly where it was, but in any case, it's okay. But that was probably the most rewarding project. But you've got to have something on the bench. If you're a ham radio operator, some guys like to just talk on the radio, and that's fine. But I recommend. I think that it's important to get into your tinkerer mode now and then, and to have something on the bench that you're working on.
Do you have a bucket list project?
A bucket list project,
right?
Well, let's see. I built
something that you'd like to build in the future. It's either for reasons of money or complexity. You've decided to hold on.
I would say probably. There's two things that I really want to get done. Probably one would be to build a tube transceiver. I've got a tube transmitter that I'm working on that's not complete yet, but I'd like to build a tube transceiver or a tube amplifier. I think that would really be great. Some of these guys are just so good.
You're now in the metal business, the metal fabrication business. So it sounds to me like if you're going to build a tube chassis, you're forming your own metal in order to make this chassis?
Yeah, I'd probably build my own cabinet. But I'm not opposed to wood. I mean, I like working with wood too. But that's probably one of them. And then the other one was I definitely want to work EME. I've never made an EME QSO, and so I think that I'm just determined to get that done. And I met some guys in Europe that have some big ears, and so I'm hoping at some point my little 20 element or 22 element 432 Yagi that I've got sitting downstairs, that with a 100-watt amplifier and using JT65B, which is a mode that's popular for EME, that I'll be able to work EME with one of these guys that has a dish in Europe. There's a few guys that are extremely well equipped when it comes to EME, moon bounce, and they have big dishes, and they can hear a mouse scuttling along in Brazil from space.
Well, there's a few guys, a few hams that have been guests of the QSO Today podcast, that if you put in EME or moon bounce in the search box at the top of the page, you'll find them, and they're excellent Elmers for, this kind of mode.
Yeah, I got a message from them last year. I was attempting to get started, and for whatever reason, I got busy doing something else, and I couldn't finish. But they were like, "Oh, when are you going to be on?" They were really eager. I got some emails from them, and they were like, "We're waiting for you," because they want to work Israel on EME on 70 centimeters. So they're eager, and they're out there, and they're really good guys, and they're extremely good technicians and engineers. These guys are really top notch. They've built stations that are world class kind of professional EME stations. They're wonderful.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
I would say that on one hand, when you disappear for hours at a time, I think that XYLs can get a little bit irritated to that. I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure there are wives all over the world who wish their husbands spent a little less time in the shack than they do. But when you're absorbed in the hobby, it's not really like you're going out to play poker with the guys. You feel like you're accomplishing something technologically, or every time me personally, every time I get into the shack, I feel like I'm learning something. I feel like I'm gaining something new every single time. There's always something to learn. There's people out there that know. There's always somebody that knows more than you do, and in the ham community, let's face it, we are just inundated with extremely talented people, and so there's always something that can be learned. So for that reason, you kind of gravitate towards the shack. So that doesn't always jive with what the XYL wants, or whether your kids need something or your grandkids need something. But it's important to find a balance. But I think that overall the balance is achievable. I think especially if you sell it right, then your family realizes that having you in the shack or spending some time in the shack is actually really healthy in the long term for everybody.
Your answer kind of makes me think about the fact that I think both of us come from a generation where we had parents and grandparents who had hobbies. I remember growing up that every night after dinner, my dad was in the garage and I was holding the light on an auto project or a wood project or a metal project or whatever it was that he was doing. In those days, in the 60s, a lot of people fixed their own cars. They didn't take them to mechanics unless it was a really big project that they couldn't do in their garage. So I think that it seems at least our children's generation, they might have interests, but they don't have hobbies in the same way that we do. And as a result of that, I think maybe the spouses feel more threatened because they hadn't grown up with parents that had time-consuming interests and passions. What do you think about that?
Well, there's no question that our generation is very different than the kids these days, and we're not so much different than our parents. I remember my dad was a radio operator. Actually, I forgot to mention that. My dad was like a lot of guys. It was coming to the end of World War II, and he was too young, so he got my grandfather to lie for him, and he went into the Navy as a teenager, underage, and he ended up going to radio operator school. So I forgot to mention that before, that my dad was a Navy radio operator. Unfortunately, he was injured in an explosion, and so his radio operating career came to a quick end only probably a year after he went into the Navy. But I think that was a different generation. I think that that they appreciated. I remember going to a museum in America once where they were reviewing what life was like back in the 50s, and somebody got a dishwasher or somebody got a washing machine, and I think that technology was a big deal, but it wasn't an interest. It wasn't like a cell phone. It was a different kind of technology. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Right. I think everything was wondrous. I mean, when I pull out like a Popular Mechanics, I'll be visiting my dad in another week or so, probably about the time people are listening to this, and he has some like Popular Mechanics magazines from the 30s, and I have to say the stuff that people did mechanically was like a switchmaker's watch. I mean, every kind of device, whether it was a washing machine that had a agitation and spin and all that stuff. The mechanical drives on these devices were miracles to behold. And so I think that people were in post-war were kind of every technology was remarkable.
Yeah, I grew up in outside of Philadelphia in a little town before I ended up going to Memphis. I went from Philly to New York to college, and then I ended up out in California for a while, and then to Memphis. But when I grew up in my little neighborhood in the 60s and 70s, mostly in the 70s, everybody fixed their own stuff. My first car was a 1970 Cutlass Oldsmobile, and my dad was an Oldsmobile Cadillac dealer. So
muscle car.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was a muscle car. I had the
It's
four-door,
a classic
but,
anyway.
Yeah, I wish I still had it. But the idea of somebody else fixing your car, of somebody else changing your oil, and nowadays I see it's a shame. There are kids that don't know the difference between a Phillips and a flathead, and that don't own any tools. And in my generation, you and I are about the same generation. There's no way there would be such a thing as not having tools, or not even being able to identify basic handheld tools. If you're a ham radio operator, that's an automatic. You're going to have tools. You're going to have things to tinker. You're going to know how to solder. And so it's a little bit of a shame. They know how to. A lot of them know how to program, and they can get on the computer and they can surf the internet, but they can't tell you the difference between a pipe wrench and a crescent wrench.
Well, I might be unique. The wedding gift that I give to close friends, or the children of close friends, is a toolbox with the basic tools in it. Because I figure if you're the new husband, the new father, the new head of a household, that you should have at least some basic tools so that you can get something up for your wife, like a clothesline or whatever, and be able to do that yourself without having to hire somebody to come in and do it.
That's great. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot, because I think of my own kids who you'd think they would know a little bit more about tools, but I guess I'm guilty of the same thing of not giving them more of a tool education. However, your idea of giving a toolbox as a gift is a great idea. One thing I can say, though, my daughter actually is fairly competent with tools. So I guess I've had a little bit of success there.
There you go. What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
Probably the fact that we might be getting at the bottom. We might be getting past the bottom of the sunspot cycle. I saw the other day that there were some rumors that we might be hitting bottom and start edging up. So that's near the top of the list. And I think that also the fact that there are a lot of hams in America, that the number of hams is growing, I think that's a wonderful thing. I did want to mention that when, and this is a long, controversial idea, but the fact is, when they abolished the Morse code requirement, I was very much against that. I really felt like it was just taking ham out of ham radio. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but it really bugged me that they were going to eliminate the Morse code requirement. I think that I'm probably still 80% leaning that way. I think it was a bad idea. However, the flip side is that it makes the entry into ham radio a lot easier. And I guess the ARRL felt like that they were for it because of the fact that that they wanted to build up the population. So I think it's pretty exciting that that there are a lot of hams out there. I do want to say, in light of that, that there is a lot of maybe a little bit less professional kind of the operating skills on air are somewhat less professional than I think they were 20, 25 years ago.
Well, I think I have two responses, I think, to what you're saying. I think the first is that I think there's more amateur radio operators operating CW now than ever before in terms of the number of operators on the air. At least this is what I read, and this is what I'm told. On the one hand, on the other hand, after doing this is now episode 220 of the QSO Today podcast. After doing 220 interviews, what seems to me is that the novice experience is the one that is the experience that most of the hams that I've interviewed think was the most interesting, most magical, time of their ham radio career. Now the rest of their ham radio career is absolutely amazing, but there was something magic about that limited operation where you had a chance to get your feet wet, where you maybe had to build your first transmitter, maybe because of the mode was limited to just CW, that you also had to learn how to have proper operating skills just to be able to make the contacts. And I think that magic is what you may be missing with the new hams that are coming in. For example, with the technician class licenses, is that they instantly, for no fault of their own, end up going to VHF or UHF to the local repeaters, or even on DMR, but and thinking that where's the magic? What makes it different? And I guess that's, I think, one of the things that it seems to me is now missing with the new licensing requirements.
Well, and in light of that, I think that I'm an HF. I like working HF, and I think that HF is a skill building arena, and so when you have operators that are getting on HF, they didn't have to learn code, and now they're on HF, and they display a lot of times poor operating habits. Like, number one, listen before you transmit, and I find that happens quite frequently. You have people that are operating, and they it's like, how did they get their license? Rule number one: listen and see if is the frequency in use. Is there a QSO going on there? Basic things like if there's a DX station, if he's working split, then don't call on his frequency. Take 10 seconds out to see if he's working split. A lot of these basic things, for some reason, I've noticed more lately than 20, 25 years ago, that there's some bad operating going on there in terms of especially dealing with DX stations. It's like, take some time to listen. That's something we have to manage ourselves inside the ham community. We have to figure out a way to get across to people to use good operating practices.
Well, I think what we also need to do is mentoring. I mean, understanding how to determine whether a guy is operating split, for example, is a skill that can only be taught with the help of a mentor, because it's not something that you think about normally. I think a new ham, or even an old ham who's never operated split, may not really understand how that's actually working, because we're kind of used to this quote unquote channelized communication. And I think maybe that's kind of what happens with some of the new operators too.
Right. Well, there's a very wonderful tool that we all have in our ham shack, and that is a computer. And on the computer, we can go to a website called dxsummit.fi, Foxtrot India, and that is the DX cluster, and we can see who's on. Now, almost every time that there's any kind of rare DX on HF, you'll find it on the on dxsummit.fi, and then invariably it'll post his call sign, and next to his call sign it'll say listening up 2, listening up 3. So before somebody even gets on the air, they can turn on the computer that's already in their shack and see if the guy is listening up and not cause the problem by transmitting immediately on the guy's frequency. That's just one example of where a little bit of patience can go a long way in order to keep order, not necessarily keeping order, but in order to facilitate a more civilized kind of exchange with a DX station. The fact is, we're all hunting. If you're on HF, there's a good chance you're hunting DX. You want to build up your country totals. You want to hopefully make it to the top, and which I'm still working on, like a lot of people. And so it just makes things easier if the whole community will use good practices. By the way, there is the code of conduct, or the code of DX code of conduct, or HF code of conduct. And the first thing, I don't have it memorized, but I think one of the things at the top of the list is to listen to see if it's proper for you to transmit right now. And I think that over the last 30 years, so it's not as civilized as it was, particularly if there's a DX station and everybody's hunting him. But, hopefully things will improve. We all work together.
So do you have different advice that you'd give to newer returning hams?
Play around with everything. Do as much as you can. Try out every little avenue. There's digital now. You've got FT8. You've got, which is extremely popular. I'm sure you know about the FT8, which is a digital mode. You've got JT65, which is slower, but is JT65B is really great for EME if you want to play with that. But I would say to ham radio operators, try everything that you can manage to fit into your shack, and don't shy away from sitting down with a breadboard and building little circuits that you might find in a book or online. Because building those little circuits, even if they're inconsequential circuits, an op-amp circuit or something like that, don't shy away from that. Go ahead and do it. Build it, check it out, test it, and then tear it apart, and then go build something else. You don't have to build. Don't shy away from building these little ones, because let's put it this way: we'd all love to build a radio like an ICOM 7300. I mean, you love to be able to build that in your shop, in your shack yourself. It's not going to happen. You're not ICOM. You're not Kenwood. You're not going to build a masterpiece of a radio in your shack. However, there are many things that you can do, and each thing that you build is a learning experience for the next thing that you build. And so I think that all hams should sit down and play and tinker and build things that cook resistors and then start over and do it again, because it's that experience of building and failing and then succeeding and that leads to, okay, now I build a transmitter, and now I build a transceiver, and now I build a really nice receiver, and it actually I built a superhet. I built a superhet receiver in the shack. I mean, all those things provide tremendous personal satisfaction, and I think that's really what ham radio is all about. Is let's face it, at the end of the day, we get a great deal of satisfaction out of the hobby, and what more can you ask?
Along with what you're saying, I interviewed Mike Rainey, AA1TJ, in episode 80 of the QSO Today podcast, and all of his projects are built on these little protoboards. So he'll take a compact fluorescent, he'll rip it apart, and he'll build himself a QRPP, meaning a very low power transmitter, and then he'll see if it works. And then he'll put that design up on his website, and then he'll go and he'll build another one and put that up on his website. So there's a lot you can do, even with a little breadboard, to be on amateur radio. And with a lot of the components that are found in a compact fluorescent light bulb, you can work 80 meters. CW, most likely. You're not going to build a modulated transmitter, but CW, and that's actually pretty cool too, and that's a great way to spend your ham radio time.
No, people should definitely not shy away from QRP. I've been playing with QRP also. Like I said, every avenue of ham radio I've kind of like poked my head in and done as much as I could to learn more and more and more. But I would say that with QRP, QRP can be tremendously rewarding. And I mentioned before, you asked me things that I'm really proud of. Well, one of the things I'm really proud of is the fact that I worked a guy back when I was in Jerusalem. I worked a guy in Texas on 30 milliwatts of power, and it was a tiny little QRP transmitter that I built on a breadboard, and I worked this guy on with 30 milliwatts. Now it just so happened that he had 3 or 4 stacked Yagis, but so his ears were great. But it can be done, and let me tell you something. If you pull off something like that, you walk out of the shack that day saying, "Oh, you can't believe what I just did."
Well, that's a MacGyver moment, don't you think?
Yeah, well, yeah. It's the kind of thing where you have to call one of your ham friends because it's possible that your XYL is not going to appreciate that. But you might have to call one of your hand friends and say, "Guess what? I just worked a guy in Texas on 30 milliwatts." And so don't underestimate the power of low power, of being able to tinker in your little laboratory and build a little transmitter out of nothing, and then actually work somebody who's a couple thousand miles away.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was really a blast, and I'm sorry that we normally don't have as much time to talk when we see each other because the events are frenetic. But I'm so glad that you took this hour and a half now to speak to me. So with that, I want to wish you 73 and thank you. 73. It was very, very enjoyable, and happy to talk to you at any time. And I just want to mention one recollection. I don't know if the people that are listening to the podcast will relate, but one of the special things I have to say, still, you made me aware of this a couple of years ago, but when you posted the video of your mother on Let's Make a Deal, on the inaugural episode of Let's Make a Deal, when I think of you, for some reason that video pops into my mind. Isn't that funny? So I find that to be. I have to say that is. I find that to be extraordinarily entertaining and satisfying to say, hey, that's Eric's mom on the first episode of Let's Make a Deal. The pilot episode of Let's Make a Deal. She was the very first contestant on the pilot episode of Let's Make a Deal. So if for no other reason, we have plenty of reasons to talk and lots of ham radio reasons and things to talk about. But I have to say that seeing your mother with Monty Hall in the pilot episode of Let's Make a Deal is truly a highlight of one of the things we share. You know what's funny about that video is that I only recall her, in her later years. I don't recall what kind of person she was, as a young mother, because I think that was 1964. Yeah, it was fun. It was fun to see that. There was somebody I went to school with. Actually high school with, who works in Hollywood, and she was actually the one who actually was able to fish that out of the Let's Make a Deal archives and put that up on YouTube. So, that was really a bonus. I think, didn't we use that as a trivia question for our trivia net on our All-Star thing one night? I think we did. I think that also, I don't know if it's posted on your website with the podcast, but I think that it's definitely worthy to put a link to that video, because that is. I'll put it on your show notes page then, so that anybody that goes to the 4X1KS show notes page will see at the very bottom the Let's Make a Deal link, where my mother is the very first contestant with Monty Hall. Well worth watching. 73. Really worth it. Okay, 7-3. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mark. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in 4X1KS in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Beep, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.